there are dietary patterns in nature, and the refrigerator insulates us from those. And scarcity is the driver, and the product of scarcity is diversity. Scarcity forces you to eat things you probably wouldn't eat. And what's interesting about that is there are synergies between foods, synergies between opposing food groups, such that we're in this era where the meat guys vilify the plants, the plant guys vilify the meats. And it's really fascinating when you dig into this. What you see is that the exact category of food the other guys are vilifying is exactly what you need to offset the toxicities of your own hero food.
My podcast guest who I have on today, I think it was one of the few times that I almost broke the health podcasting internets, or at least he did, because we recorded a doozy of a 2-parter episode that just blew people's minds in terms of nutrition myths and truths and super practical advice about your gut, your biome, the way you eat, etc. Well, I've invited him back. His name is Joel Greene, and Joel is a man of many talents. He just finished this book, which is basically dog-eared already. I have so many things folded over and highlighted in this thing, Joel, that we get a chance to talk about. Every time I hang out with Joel, I learn something new. I don't know how he stays so on the cutting edge of what he does, besides maybe he lives in his mom's basement reading books all day. I don't know. But Joel, how do you describe yourself to people? Because I know you're not like a doctor or I don't know if you're an RD, or what do you say?
I would say an autistic, embittered consumer.
An autistic, embittered consumer. All right. You're AEC. Joel Greene, AEC.
There you go.
Well, yeah. Well, you wrote that original book, and the original book that we did that podcast episode about. Oh, and by the way, I should tell people, you got to go listen to the other podcast I did with Joel. And so all the show notes for this one are going to be at bengreenfieldlife.com/immunity code. That's bengreenfieldlife.com/immunity code. So anyways, Joel, you wrote that original book, The Immunity Code, and then this thing shows up at my house like 3 months ago called The Way. The way I interpreted The Way is that it's kind of like boots on the streets, how you eat based on everything you saw in the Immunity Code. But am I correct in that was kind of why you wrote it?
I think the number one reason I wrote it was confusion. What had bubbled up, I think, in the interim time from publication of the first book was just completely polarized beliefs about everything, and more just people not knowing what to think. So what I wanted to do in this book, above all, was lay out kind of a framework that the average person could just rely on sense, more or less, to just kind of make sense of things, just return to sense without over complicating things. So that was kind of the number one reason. And then there was a lot of ground still left to cover, I think, in the first book, and I didn't have the room to do it. In fact, the original book was 800 pages when I first wrote it. So
yeah, but your books are fun. You don't do like the cartoons and the illustrations in this thing, do you?
No, so the funny thing that happened there was
Blacker.
I certainly wish I did. Yeah, that would be fun to have that skill. No.
Well, the reason I bring that up is it actually does have really great illustrations and graphs, and I'm not just blowing smoke. I read a lot of nutrition books, and yours are very good. Before we started recording, we were talking about how I did a workout with my sons this morning, where we did some breath work, did some heat and some cold. We put on some weighted vests and did some calisthenic stuff around the house. And I said, well, I'm just fostering their pathway into becoming harder to kill. And maybe that was an accidental segue into what I actually wanted to ask you about as kind of a lead off. And that's this whole concept of dietary diversity. You're not really like a follow this exact diet type of guy from the impression that I get, but you almost describe dietary diversity as like a protective mechanism. I just want to hear, in your own words, why you would say that, how you would describe dietary diversity as nature's protective mechanism.
Yeah, maybe the easy way to answer that is just a couple simple questions that kind of illustrate it. So, are blueberries healthy? Would you say blueberries are healthy?
Well, Joel, they must be organic, and if not organic, taken home and rinsed in vinegar and water.
All right.
And if eaten in the in the morning, thus breaking your 18-hour intermittent fast, could make you obese. But besides that, yeah, I would say in general, I and most people might say they're healthy.
What about blueberries at bedtime?
I think it would kind of depend on metabolic flexibility, on how much fructose you've consumed the rest of the day, or calories in general.
There you go. What about 2 pounds of blueberries at bedtime?
Can they be in ice cream?
It's whatever you want to do. Yeah.
I think that might be a little much.
Okay. All right. So yeah. So this kind of illustrates it right there, and I think we'll probably come back to this here and there. But what we just did was showed something really kind of it's always been true and has been lost, and that's that the health of any food does not depend solely on the health properties within the food. It depends on other things equally. It depends on the dose, like how much. It depends on when you eat it and context. So a lot of different things actually play out into the health properties of a food, right? And so that's interesting kind of as a foundation, because we're in an era diet-wise that to me is mind-boggling, because I grew up in a world where everybody agreed what a healthy diet was, that it was nutritionally dense, balanced, and diverse. That was, everybody agreed that was what a healthy diet was. And so this kind of really was the motive behind the book, which is that's gone. That doesn't exist anymore. I've read science papers, literal science papers, talking about the problem that we don't have a definition anymore of what a healthy diet is. What's interesting is that we've kind of drifted into the notion or an age of exclusionism,
right?
Or rather, cutting out entire categories of foods is the way you get to health. And the interesting thing is you have different tribes who fight over, well, no, your food's the bad category, mine's the good one. You got it all wrong, So that being said, it just brings up a really interesting question, which is, well, could you eat too much anything? I mean, is it possible that you could get, it doesn't matter what it is it possible you get too much anything? And when you look at, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at ancestral diets, looking at the research on them, and pretty much seems to be like the weight of the data supports this idea that they were quite varied, actually. And when you dig into it, the driver is scarcity. So civilization is a bubble, and it insulates us from these patterns in nature, light and dark, heat and cold, right? But there are dietary patterns in nature, and the refrigerator insulates us from those. And scarcity is the driver, and the product of scarcity is diversity. Scarcity forces you to eat things you probably wouldn't eat. And what's interesting about that is it seems to protect you from eating too much of anything. And when we get into this rabbit hole, what becomes readily evident quite rapidly is that there are synergies between foods, synergies between opposing food groups, such that we're in this era where the meat guys vilify the plants, the plant guys vilify the meats. And it's really fascinating when you dig into this. What you see is that the exact category of food the other guys are vilifying is exactly what you need to offset the toxicities of your own hero food. And it's, yeah.
And I want to get into that, because you talk about that quite a bit in the book, about how everything from the way that you combine foods to the nature of the microbiome, et cetera, might dictate whether, say, meat is good for you or meat is bad for you, or potatoes are good for you or potatoes are bad for you. But back to the scarcity thing. As you were talking about that, I thought, well, there might be other things that could have, from an ancestral standpoint, influence food choices. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I think it does impact a very small part of the exclusionary nature of many popular diets, carnivore diet, paleo diet, vegan, etc. And that would be that I would still imagine that even many, many, many years ago, that if someone consumed a food group, and even author Fred Provenza has a book called, I believe it's called Nourish, about how even animals will self-select a diet based on the impact on things like nausea, fertility, etc. That if someone were to eat a particular food group that did result in nausea, sickness, death, large amounts of that food appearing in the fecal matter afterwards, etc., they might, based on probably their individual gut tendencies, avoid that food for life or for a certain period of time. And based on that, I think that it's possible that some of the exclusionary nature of some of the diets that people choose, like let's say a carnivore diet due to autoimmune issues, or a low FODMAP diet due to SIBO issues, or an antihistamine diet due to sympathetic nervous system overstimulation, histaminergic issues, might be appropriate in certain contexts if that diet were harming someone from a health standpoint and it wasn't just based on scarcity or availability.
Yeah, so that brings us into what I think is a really fascinating point. And I agree. I think there are definitely times and situations and occasions where, you need to have an exclusionary diet for different reasons. I'm certainly not against that. That being said, I would venture to offer that there's really only one path that is going to give everybody the thing they want long-term, which is, lasting and real health. And that is a diet that's nutrient dense and diverse. And that, I would just argue that's the only path. Now, what you just interjected was what I talk about quite a bit in the book, which is the variable of time and how time changes the equation of things. And this gets into something that I think is missing, which is that when we look at food and diets and we assess them in our brain, we're not actually overlaying a template of what's going to happen over time, such that it's pretty easy to see there are real forces that change the equation over time. In the book, I wrote about 4. The simplest one is just accumulation. You can accumulate things from a given diet and they can change the equation. Example would be like leafy greens and nickel. Okay. So you're eating way too many leafy greens, and at first there's all these benefits from it. But then over time you start to accumulate too much nickel, and then you get a nickel allergy from that. Now you have to avoid leafy greens. Okay. And there's tons of examples like that.
Organ meats and uric acid, that would probably be another one I could think of.
Yeah.
Top of my head.
So that being said, there's also a way out of that, and it's well known in immunotherapy. It's just titration, which is that you can slow titrate your way back into diversity. The issue we run into most often is that there's no accounting for time, so we think that once is forever. So if I have something that's developed, that's it, I'm done. I can never eat this thing again. And then the second issue most often is that there's no accounting for microdosing in the thing that is troublesome and microdosing your way out of the problem. But you've probably seen it. I've seen it dozens of hundreds of times where you can have an allergy to something and you start with, like a half a pea and work yourself up to a pea. And then, after about a year.
So the whole nature of that new book, Blind Spots, I'm going to interview the author about the tragedy of advising mothers to avoid eating peanuts and advising mothers to avoid giving their baby peanuts ever, and the surge in peanut allergies that resulted because of that.
Yeah, and all this just speaks to is there's a variable that's been missing, and it's the impact of time, and it's the most important. It's a reality that you're going to run into. And if diet as a paradigm just starts to factor time into the equation, it really changes how we look at things. So that's what I would offer.
Right. That makes sense. So boots on the streets, when it comes to this whole concept of dietary diversity, I think it's chapter 7 in the book where you start to lay out, well, this food is good for you. And by the way, this food is bad for you. And you do it with some popular items. Steak, I think, is one. Potatoes, I believe, could be another. Can you use a couple of those as illustrative examples for people to understand why it is that a food could be good or bad for you?
Yeah, so we've entered this era where you have polar opposite tribes, each talking about things that are true and scaring the daylights out of everybody so that, meat is good, meat is bad. And I don't know what to think because this guy's really convincing, but that guy's just as convincing and he says the opposite, right?
And he has a 6-pack.
There you go.
But he's rich and a billionaire, and
right.
Branded
doesn't live in the bubble that anybody else does. So yeah. So by the way, I loved your blueberry answer. That was very nuanced. So yeah. So I just did it as an exercise. Like, okay, let me argue both ways. We'll do anti-meat Joel, and then we'll do love meat Joel. Either way, and just take one example. So you can look at you can look at the issue of non-human sugars. You could look at, remember we went to dinner, I don't know, a few years ago, and your friend Max was there, and he brought up new 5GC, which is a non-human sugar. Yeah, it's N-glycolineurominic acid. So this is a sugar that is, it's not native to humans, but it's found in meat. And you can make a really good case that you should avoid meat because you're going to accrue this sugar over time. In fact, the World Health Organization actually puts recommendations on meat intake to prevent the excess of this sugar from lodging into human tissues. And what happens is we eat meat, the sugar gets incorporated into our cell membranes. It's a foreign object. The immune system sees it, starts to attack it. And so you can make this case that if you're eating too much meat, you can develop an autoimmune issue. And there's some evidence to support this. When certain kinds of tumors are looked at, they're super saturated with new 5GC. Okay. So I could just scare the heck out of you based on that. Right. And then I can go and look at, I can pull up a graph. In fact, I use the same graph to argue different ways in the book. So I start with trying to scare you about cattle meat. And I make the case that cattle organs are super saturated with the new 5GC. You better avoid those. And then I just make the reverse case where, say, there's another sugar, it's closely related, it's called new 5AC. And it's a cousin of that. And the thing about new 5AC is it's essential for brain development. Like if you don't get this sugar in the diet, principally you get it from, the mom's going to get it from animal sources, your brain never fully develops. So that's kind of important if your brain doesn't develop. And the cool thing about it is the best sources of it.
So basically it just comes down to, do you want an autoimmune disease or do you want to be stupid?
Isn't that always the choice in life?
It's always the choice. Do I want diarrhea or stupidity?
I think I'll take the autoimmune issue. We can hack our way out of that.
Yeah. So with the meat thing, back to the new 5GC versus the new 5AC, how do you tackle that?
Yeah, so the issue with that just becomes, number one, diversity in the diet prevents you from getting too much of anything, okay? And then the issue with new 5GC, what we find is that the very foods that are vilified by the other side of the equation, so that some of these plant foods actually stimulate bacteria that help you break it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was hoping you would go there. Talk to me about that, about how microbiome diversity can actually solve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, very interesting. So there's a mistaken belief right now. It's widely prevalent, and it's that if you eat a food, then you absorb everything in the food. That's not the reality. The reality is that the microbiome acts sort of as a cloud, as a filter, and it's the makeup of the microbiome cloud that ultimately is going to determine things. So really good example is oxalates. So we have this whole school dedicated to anything with oxalates, avoid it. Well, what you find is that there are over 1,500 bacteria that can break down oxalates in the colon. And several of those are bifido and lactobacillus species, something like it's in the dozens that do that. And so what you find is that an optimized microbiome that are rich in those species has the potential to break down oxalate. And then you get the benefits of those foods without the negatives. All right. This is a Greta Thunberg moment. I can hear it. How dare you? Benefits?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I hope people don't miss the nuance of what you're saying, and that is that basically, and correct me if I get this wrong, Joel, many of these foods, say spinach or kale, that might contain oxalates that we're being told to avoid, are the same fibrous foods that help the butyric acid production and bacterial balance in the colon that would then allow you to be able to digest those same oxalates.
Yeah, so it's this weird catch-22. So a lot of these foods actually feed the bacteria that help break down oxalates, and there's another level to it, which is when you begin to look at the most serious problems you're going to have to solve. Like if you're interested in health, you're going to have to solve the aging in the cardiovascular system. There's no getting around that. I hate to break it to everybody, but the number one thing that's probably going to kill you is 30%, 31% likelihood of death from some CVD related thing. That's mostly dietary. So when you look at the cardiovascular issues you have to solve, guess which foods are foundational to solving those? It's leafy greens, it's nitrate-rich veggies, things that feed the nitrate-reducing bacteria in the mouth and stimulate the gut immune axis. And there's a lot of reasons why. So you could look at these foods and say, oh, they're bad, they contain oxalates. you could also look at them and say, oh, they're good. They help solve the decline of the cardiovascular system. So what do I believe? And a more correct version is just to understand that an optimized microbiome helps you to negate and helps you to break down oxalates. Now, there's a dose issue here, because right away, I can already hear it out there. There's a conflation that happens, which is, yeah, but the average person's getting way too much, And so, oh, okay, we just conflated the health properties with the dose. So now we're talking dose. We're not talking, okay. So now that it's a dose issue, yes, that's correct, but that's true of anything. So if you're overdosing anything, you're going to find issues. So yes, it's entirely possible to overwhelm an optimized microbiome, eating way too much. That's true. However, diversity in the diet, here's an example, protects you.
Yeah, and it's a little bit, again, kind of like a paradoxical, you said catch-22 situation, because the longer period of time you go restricting certain food groups and limiting dietary diversity, the less diverse your microbiome becomes, and the less and less likely you are able to handle dietary diversity.
Yeah. And so that's you see this on a lot of different diets. You see it on carnivore diets, for example. So you can make a case that carnivore diets improve the gut. We see Akkermansia levels increase somewhat. Yeah, but the problem is you're reducing the diversity of bifido at the same time. And bifido is a controller on Akkermansia, keeping you from getting too much of it. So you've taken away the control spigot, and now over time you reduce your diversity of bifido, which is the center of the gut immune axis, and you're increasing this thing that eats the gut lining. Okay, and you can have problems from that. So again, it's the same thing over and over and over, where as you begin to reduce diversity in the diet, you see these consequences long term.
Yeah, and I was going to save this question. Actually, I wanted to ask you this a little bit later on, but I think I might just throw this in there right now, because I'm sure people are wondering, how would you therefore eat? Like in your book, you kind of lay out like a 2-day protocol of what a perfect scenario would look like. And obviously, as you know, this is a big question. You could probably spend the next 20 minutes kind of getting into the answer to this question, which I don't mind. But how are you suggesting that people then eat?
Yeah. Well, what I lay out in the book is at its core super simple, and here it is. Basically, it's you have a day that is foraging foods, and then the following day is a fast amplified by modern supplemental technology, and then you have feasting foods, and that's it. That's the gist of it. And then within that, there's tons of layers and all this stuff we could get into, complexity, but it's designed. The design of that is designed to mimic the 4 dietary rhythms that you will see in nature. And what I mean by that is that, again, going back to biohacking, we're into we're into matching nature's rhythms of light and dark. No, it's night. You got to put these glasses on. Okay. And then you got to do this thing to block these frequencies, because nature has these and civilization has nerfed it. And
right.
Now you got to go get cold because
not eat blueberries. Yeah. Leave out the blueberries. Yep.
Not at bedtime and not 2 pounds.
Yeah.
Nature has dietary rhythms. In fact, literally everything that lives is consumed during its waking hours of getting food. So nature has dietary rhythms, and they're actually quite easy to see. One is just going hungry. We call it fasting now. The other is foraging, which I call basically just looking for foods you prefer not to eat. The other is feasting, which is animal proteins. It's funny.
Right. You should throw out a caveat in there, by the way, because I don't like to eat Domino's pizza. So within reason, foods that you don't like to eat.
You know what? If you come down here, we got to go to Truly. Did you see Dana White's review of Truly Pizza?
I don't even know what that is.
Oh my gosh, you got to come down here.
All right.
Yeah, so Dana White did a review. It's the best pizza in the world. It's from Dana Point.
Yeah. All right.
What is that? Feasting. So feasting is you got a deer, you got a fish, and you eat the whole thing. All right, but then you go back to being hungry. And then there's a season of abundance where whatever, you got a whole herd and you eat good for 6 months. But those are the dietary rhythms of nature, and that pattern is designed to replicate that. So foraging foods are, again, foods of lesser preference. Things like roots. Roots are a food of last resort. They actually did a quiz with the Hasda and asked them, hey, stack rank it. And they were like, oh, honey, number 1, roots last. Nobody wants to eat roots, but roots, mushrooms, leafy greens, berries, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then the second day is feasting.
Okay. All right. By the way, the people who didn't like roots must not have discovered my recipe for carrot fries yet, but we can save that for another day.
Let's talk about that.
So we got foraging foods. Then we have a fasting period. Then we have feasting foods. Feasting foods. I am a practical guy. Walk me through what these 2 days would actually look like. And you even talk a little bit about like the movement patterns that might be woven into that. So give me the practical nitty gritty of what am I going to wake up and do on day one? What am I going to wake up and do on day two?
Yeah. So day one, either one of these days, first of all, either one of these days can be subcaloric. I prefer typically the first day to be subcaloric, but you can do it either day. So wake up, usually nuts and berries. That's what I'm doing late. And my food of choice is walnuts and blueberries usually. And I don't measure calories.
This is the foraging day.
Yeah, foraging day. So walnuts, blueberries typically. And there's a lot of reasons behind those two that we can get into. And then lunch is typically for me like a purple sweet potato or like a Greek salad or baked potato, like some kind of roots, resistant starch, do it cold. And then there's a couple of preload meals before each meal. So I'll do, something like an apple or maybe a little bit of nut butter.
What's the purpose of the preload meal?
A lot of different reasons. You can use them for different purposes. Mainly it's a GLP-1 activator. So you just hit GLP-1 20 minutes before your meal. And the really weird thing on this, like through the first half of the day is I'm not hungry at all. It's really weird. And you're not eating much either. There's not a lot of protein, not a lot of things in there. But you're mimicking foraging. And then dinner typically is usually leafy greens with some kind of white meat, chicken, fish. That's the first day. And then the second day would be wake up.
Wait. Just backpedal just a second. On that first day, are you exercising at all? Because you're not eating a lot of calories. What's the actual workout look like?
Yeah, mostly it's cardio stuff. So it's either, I like to do stairs of late. So I'm either running stairs or, some time on the bike, or it's anything to keep the heart rate and push VO2 max. Okay,
VO2 max. So when you say cardio, like you're relatively high intensity cardio.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we've both been on this VO2 max kick for a while.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Got it. So day one's foraging. You're still exercising. You're doing cardio, pushing yourself in that respect. You get to the evening. You fasted overnight. Then what comes next?
So then this is what I call the amplified fast. So the thing to understand here, what sets this up is that we have entered this age of fasting where you just think fasting is this thing you do. But if you do fasting in nature, you never do fasting alone. You always do fasting with foraging. Always. You're never in nature going to sit around and just be hungry. You're not going to do that. You're like going to be looking for stuff. And so typically when you're looking for stuff,
unless it's some intentional religious fast or self-denial, like a monk who might crawl to a cave and fast for 100 days or something like that.
Or something you might do on a Ben Greenfield retreat.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Yep.
So, by the way, you're one, where's the one next year?
I have many, but the one coming up is in Ibiza, Spain, and then Portugal.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that looks cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So, wake up, and then the main thing here, the thing to understand, and this is fascinating to break down, the bacteria, the keystone bacteria that are spun up by those foods on day one that go with foraging, when you look at the benefits of fasting, they nearly one-to-one mimic them. They almost exactly mimic them. You can look at, like, for example, the species of bifidobacteria. You're going to see AMPK activation. You're going to see HDAC inhibition. You're going to see all this stuff resulting from that. Same with Akkermansia. And so nature has kind of provided this way when you're in a starved state to optimize the renewal of the body through going hungry and foraging foods at the same time. And so what that whole first day exists for is to spin those bacteria up that mimic fasting. So the following day in a fast, all those pathways are already lit. And then we just add all the modern stuff. So typically, like for me, that would be get up, cold plunge, supplement, different stacks for different purposes of supplements, usually longevity based. So I do my own stuff, which is Young Body, which is NAC glycine, AKG, white willow bark, and then I'll stack other things around that. And then it's usually something intense. So like either sprints or go to the gym. And what I find that's really cool is I don't have to warm up if I get cold first. Like I just get out of the cold and slap my muscles and I can go right to it. I don't have to warm up.
Yeah, that's actually what I love about a pre-exercise cold plunge. It works wonders. Right now I'm on this kick where I do a cold plunge within 20 minutes of waking every day, which is also a slap in the face. But yeah, doing it whenever you work out, doing a cold plunge pre-workout. There's even a guy named Thomas Seeger makes a pretty strong case that the surge in endorphins and the endocrine response, including testosterone, from that approach, paired with the potential for a high amount of anti-inflammatory activity and a drop in those same compounds if you do it post-exercise, would dictate that anytime you can choose to do so, do your cold plunge pre-exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing that for years. I think it's kept my hormones. I'm not on TRT. I'm going to be 60 this year. I think it's the thing is, you in a cold state, you're doing things like sprints, and then you're augmenting that with supplements, and it's all that window of time 3 times a week. So I'll do that, and then I'll just fast until noon, and then I'll feast. So like feast typically could be, a giant omelet with giant egg white omelet with cheese and a couple of burgers. Big caloric meal, huge amount of protein, huge amount of animal protein. And then I'll fast, and then I'll go 6 hours, and then I'll have a really big dinner typically.
Yeah. So the general mentality here, if I could sum it up the way I'm thinking about it, Joel, is day one, the foraging day, might be a day very similar to how you'd act if you were truly out foraging, or like what we might consider to be mostly aerobic activity: nuts, seeds, berries, greens, etc. Go to bed, wake up the next morning, and now you're jumping in a cold plunge, maybe mimicking the ancestral activity of swimming across an icy cold river, and you're charging up a mountain with a spear, and you're killing a deer, or you're harvesting the 12 eggs your chicken laid, or whatever, and then you're going into feast mode, choosing foods that would be foods that from an ancestral standpoint would be less available in a foraging environment.
Pretty much, yep.
Interesting. So there's a lot of subtle nuances in terms of the science behind it, which you lay out in the book. But I have specific questions about some of the specific subtle nuances I think would be most interesting for my audience. One that you already mentioned, GLP-1. And you say that we can trigger GLP-1 from addressing the gut and the biome. Can you get into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So when you look at, first of all, let's just take at a high level insulin. What GLP-1s have brought to the forefront is this notion that efficient insulin function is not just about insulin. It's actually about other hormones as well. And so I lay it out in the book, which is the complete family. And so if we start talking about insulin, we've got to talk about insulin, glucagon, GLP-1, GIP, adiponectin, and then that all rests on a layer of the microbiome. And it all works together as one thing. So if we're going to look at, hey, what would be the perfect diet to stimulate insulin? We've got to take all that into account. So with respect to the microbiome, what's interesting is that the keystone bacteria that get fed by that pattern, for example, Akkermansia, make proteins that stimulate GLP-1. And they also together work to modulate insulin function. So for example, the phytobacteria modulates the composition of bile acids. It helps to make insulin more sensitive. And so these bacteria are actually very much involved in the family of insulin function, making insulin efficient, and specifically making peptides and proteins that stimulate GLP-1.
So when you look at a lot of these, fibrous foods, foraging foods, et cetera, I'm assuming that those would have more likelihood to increase GLP-1 than some of the feasting foods. Is that kind of the idea behind a lot of these companies now that are producing, supplements that are supposed to increase GLP-1 via the microbiome? Like Pendulum has their Akkermansia. There's another one called Calocurb that's making the one that's super bitter to trigger the bitter receptors in the intestine. These seem to have a lot of the same compounds that vegetables, herbs, spices, seeds, nuts, et cetera might have.
Well, I wouldn't say that fiber or compounds from the microbiome have a greater potential to trigger GLP-1. I would argue probably the feasting foods have a great potential to trigger GLP-1, like things like eggs. Yeah, like when you really look at it and you look at what triggers it, dairy, eggs, all these things work together. but they work together with the foraging foods. They actually work together. So you'll find, like, for example, something you'd never think of, like apples. Apples really trigger satiety. So I guess it gets to the approach and the way you want to do it. Me personally, never ever do it through trying to supplement things like Akkermansia, because it needs to exist in a balance with Bifido, and you can throw that balance off and get more problems than it's worth.
Right. And then, by the way, in their defense, I think this one company, it is Akkermansia, Bifido, and Butyricum that they use, I believe.
Yeah. But that being said, I just think the optimal way to get it is through diet and through food. I think you can do it through food, where you're not only stimulating GLP-1, but you're also accounting for adiponectin, and you're accounting for glucagon and all these other things that are part of the equation that only food can address.
So dietary diversity is directly linked to satiety via these GLP-1 mechanisms in a potentially much more complete way than, say, just supplementing your way into it.
I would say at the highest level, it's linked to efficient insulin function. And it's quite fascinating. When you I've looked at this. There's not a diet that exists right now that has purposely set out to hit everything, to hit all the insulin hormones and the microbiome. Not one. Like, they don't even think about it. But when you look at how insulin works...
I don't know, Joel. I need to send you my cookbooks.
Well,
I mean, and your diet, by the way, it seems like your diet does that. The immunity comes.
Of course,
of course. Okay, so we'll quit tooting our own horns, but do progress.
Yeah. Excluding said company here. How dare you? Excluding said company. You're going to get optimal GLP-1 activation when insulin works efficiently, and it's kind of this thing of like, you're not going to get real health, lasting health, unless insulin works efficiently. And if you want that, you're going to need this whole family of things being hit. And dietary diversity doesn't address just GLP-1 and GIP. It also addresses adiponectin. It also addresses glucagon. In fact, this is really interesting. The fingerprints of dietary diversity are everywhere once you start looking for them. So if you look at, like, let's take insulin, and let's just accept the premise that you're not going to have lasting health without efficient insulin production. Okay, so simple layer. Okay, that means you need minimally insulin and glucagon to be very, very efficient. Okay, so those two are mutually exclusive. Like, they both need to be stimulated, but you can't stimulate them at the same time, right? So that what that speaks to is that these distinct mechanisms you can have insulin resistance, you can have glucagon resistance. They both need to be stimulated, but not too much. And it's different elements, different mechanisms that optimally stimulate both at different times, which itself just points to diversity goes right at all of the mechanisms of insulin, not just GLP-1. And yeah, that is a fingerprint of dietary diversity.
Okay, got it. Is it true that you actually have a shake before dinner? And if so, is it based on some of the mechanisms that you just described as far as the ingredients in that shake?
Sometimes. Everything's context. So if I'm hungrier, like I'm feeling a lot of hunger, and I'm just feeling it that day, then there's a shake in the book I call the GLP-1 shake, and it's just a combination of things that hit GLP-1.
GLP-1 shake. I see how you find this. I do remember one part I was going to ask about. You said honey and stevia connect together to stimulate GLP-1. I remember that part in the pre-dinner shake.
Yeah. So whey protein stimulates GLP-1. It's just stacking everything that we believe stimulates GLP-1. So whey protein definitely stimulates GLP-1. Honey stimulates GLP-1. Stevia. So there's some good research. 200 milligrams of stevia will stimulate GLP-1.
Really?
They just stack
Does
it all
the
together.
stevia need to be combined with honey? Is there something going on there?
It's just synergistic.
Okay.
Yeah. What's been shown is that stevia works better with sugar. So stevia on its own stimulates GLP-1 to one degree, but then when you add sugar to it, it stimulates GLP-1 even better. And so honey's kind of your perfect sugar.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I was wondering about the reasoning behind that. So the pre-dinner shake, theoretically, this might be something that you could do before you go to a party, social event. Maybe you've been invited out to a restaurant that doesn't have the greatest things on the menu from a health standpoint. You could flip to the pre-dinner shake page, have that, the honey, the stevia, the whey protein, etc., and have a pretty satiated appetite going into dinner.
Yeah. So let's take that in its simplest form, just super simple. The idea would be like, have an egg, hard-boiled egg, 20 minutes prior to going to your dinner party, So that egg's going to hit the gut. It's going to trigger GLP-1, GIP. And so as you start eating, you're just going to get fuller much quicker. It's just simply timing things.
Please tell me I can put salt and hot sauce on the boiled eggs.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right.
Of course. Mandatory.
Those don't kill the little GLP-1 babies. All right. Good to know.
We love our GLP-1 babies.
All right. So we're on the GLP-1 topic. Obviously, that's a hot topic related to weight loss right now. But you also talk about something called Neurotensin. I haven't seen that written about too much. What is Neurotensin? How does that relate to weight loss?
Well, it's a hormone. It's a neurotransmitter, and it's involved. It's involved in the hunger response or the food response in an interesting way. Basically, GLP-1, the GIP-GLP-1 axis kind of acts like a enough, not enough kind of thing. It's like, okay, I've had enough. Where neurotensin does that, but it also sort of throttles the reward from different foods. So it's like first slice of pizza, mind-boggling. Fifth slice of pizza, didn't taste, And so there's a hormone in our brain at work that's throttling down or throttling up the reward from food, and neurotensin does that. So what's interesting about it is some interesting research. One is in mice, it's really depressed after fat loss. And what's very interesting is bariatric surgery. It doesn't lower after bariatric surgery. So if
neurotensin does not get lower after bariatric surgery. Okay.
Yeah, and it kind of explains the success of bariatric surgery in a way, because so one of the key hormones related to food intake is not perturbed post-fat loss. And all of this is under an umbrella, which is the post-fat loss rebound. I wrote about it quite a bit in my first book. And it's only made a better case since then. There's just a boatload of research that is now showing that this is quantifiable. It's measurable. There are clear mechanisms at work, and they're multiple redundant. There's tons of science papers on this now showing that basically, over many thousands of years, our bodies are rigged to defend against going hungry, defend against starvation, defend against fat loss to keep us alive. And neurotensin is one of a number of ways we can measure the rebound effect post-fat loss. So this thing post-fat loss drops, and it is the number one predictor of weight regain so far that we have.
Do you mean because if neurotensin drops, the food reward is going to go up, or the desire for food is going to go up?
Both. So food reward, you're going to be more rewarded for food, and you're going to want to eat more. And that's just neurotensin. That's not even counting leptin or any of the gut hormones, and all those are dysregulated too post-fat loss.
So if I was going to lose weight, but based on what you just explained, I wanted to keep neurotensin somewhat elevated so that I didn't have as much of a risk for weight rebound, is there a way to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, I built a whole course on it called Beat the Rebound. But essentially, the first thing we have to do is we need to recognize, and weight is like top of it. Sleep and weight. I mean, those are top two problems most people struggle with. Sleep, weight, and gut. So this is a huge problem. It's only getting worse. And one of the reasons it's just getting worse and worse and worse, despite every diet under the sun, is there's no acknowledgement of an entire set of mechanisms and processes that kick in the post-fat loss period that are nature's way of regaining all the weight you lost. So the first thing is we have to recognize, hey, there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that are going to start now that you've taken your post-fat loss selfie, and you got about 6 to 12 months where you need to counter these, okay? And some of it gets pretty esoteric, but the simple thing that we're trying to do post-fat loss, we have to get energy expenditure up, and we have to get all of the signaling for food intake down. That's the thrust of it. So we have to reverse those two things. So typically post-fat loss, energy expenditure is lower and the drive for food intake is higher. And so we have to put our hands and reverse those two things.
Right. Metabolism has gone down. Desire for food has gone up.
Yeah. There's other things going on, a lot of other things, but that's like, to make it simple, that's the gist of it. So let's start with, kind of like a foundational element, which is in order to get our metabolism up, we need a higher caloric load in the morning, and it needs to be very strategic. So there needs to be a bunch of protein in there, and there needs to be fermentable carbohydrates in there, things that ferment. And the reason is both of those things. So we got three things going on. We got the meal size, we have protein, and then we have fermentation in the gut. All three of those hit GLP-1. All three of them do. So when you combine things that ferment in the gut, you tend to produce the bacteria that trigger GLP-1. So potatoes, for example. And when you combine that with protein, then protein also hits GLP-1. So in other words, like steak and eggs at breakfast, for example, a baked potato and steak at breakfast with eggs, it's a natural response. Everybody kind of intuitively know what I'm saying is true. It's when we're doing it. So we're in the post-fat loss phase, we're increasing caloric load, and then we're skewing the macros at breakfast to just lay the hammer down on all of the satiety hormones, everything that signals satiety and fullness, and we're trying to get your calories up. We're trying to get your metabolic expenditure up as high as possible.
And you're not eating like that the whole day, because obviously you're eating, but you're starting off the day in a way that many people might think is paradoxical to fat loss. And I should mention, by the way, that subtle nuance, when Joel says fermentable carbohydrates, that's different than fermented carbohydrates. So this wouldn't mean like prioritizing, even though it might have some benefits here, and there could be some crossover, yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi, etc. You're more talking like resistant starch, potatoes, inulin, things like that.
Yeah, but those things can work too. You know, we're looking to create those bacteria we spoke of that hit GLP-1 in the gut, and we're looking to do that in conjunction with GLP-1 stimulating foods like protein, like small pulses of fat, everything together. And the caloric load, is very high. So that's when the body has the greatest ability to take all those calories and turn them into heat energy in the morning.
Got it.
Which goes against a lot of schools of thought. So there's the don't eat breakfast school of thought, never eat breakfast, blah, 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 all that. And the thing I think that's worth mentioning is that this is a strategy, and it is done at a specific period in time, which is the post-fat loss period. And I don't think this whole weight thing's ever going to get anywhere until there is complete acknowledgement of the post-fat loss mechanisms that kick in. They are real, they're quantifiable. I talked about one in the book, another one I talked about, and this is a brand new study. You can measure it. This group out of Harvard, they were able to measure post-fat loss tripling of the synaptic neurons that drive food reward. So they looked at the agouti-related complex, and they measured pre and post-fat loss, and they saw a tripling of neural traffic that drives increased food intake post-fat loss. So it's quantifiable.
Yeah, and so it's obviously an uphill battle, and I would raise your, it's not going to go away until we do something about the reward mechanisms, and say it's also probably not going to be until we get better padlocks for the refrigerators and app locks for Uber Eats. Just because of the rampant access as well. I think that's an elephant in the room, of course, back to the ancestral hypothesis here of constant 24/7 access to hyperpalatable foods, and paired that with low dietary diversity to a certain extent.
Your stand-up's getting way better. Are you working on it?
I'm actually walking, not standing, Joel. Okay, so a couple other questions. I know we still got time for a few more. So saturated fats. You talked about the time factor and how certain things will build up over time, but this is kind of like the opposite of that. It seems to me the argument for saturated fat. Certain things will decrease over time in the body and affect our ability to be able to deal with certain compounds. And you say that we might have more difficulty being able to handle, I think what you mean by that is we might have increased cardiovascular complications to saturated fat as we age. Can you explain how that works?
So this gets to the aging of the cardiovascular system, and I would offer it's poorly understood, rather not poorly understood in science circles, but certainly poorly understood within the biohacking community and even more so the public at large. And basically it's this, there is a 1-to-1 correspondence, if you graph this out, between the decline of the cardiovascular system and the inability to lose weight. 1-to-1. Like it's amazing. Yeah. And when you begin to break it down, it makes perfect sense. So there's three major things happening with the cardiovascular system as we get older. So the first thing is there's this class of enzymes called the NOx enzymes, and they have a big word. It's NADPH oxidases. They're the only oxidative enzymes that we know of in the entire body, the only enzymes whose purpose is to produce free radicals. And we find them in immune cells, but they also line the entire vasculature. And what they do is they take superoxide and they dismutate that down into hydrogen peroxide. And then from there, hydrogen peroxide is used in insulin signaling as a throttle, as a feedback mechanism. So when you bring glucose into cells, the NOx enzymes activate, hydrogen peroxide is produced, and it helps with vasodilation, and it helps control just how much glucose do we need in the cell. So what happens as we get older is they break. They tend to just hyperactivate, and they begin producing more and more and more hydrogen peroxide. And so when that happens, free radical stress tends to take place in the vasculature, in the endothelium. Well, that breaks the whole body. That breaks the entire body because it breaks insulin function. It breaks glucose signaling, but a lot of other things too. So what happens is when the NOx enzymes hyperactivate with age, a number of things happen. One of those things is that they are able to oxidize saturated fats into a particular compound called an oxysterol.
I see where
so an
you're going.
oxysterol is an oxidized form of a cholesterol, and they're not bad. They're actually essential. They serve as critical signaling molecules. But the issue is when you make too much, it's like anything else, you make too much. So what happens with age is that the NOx enzymes go, and then when the NOx enzymes go, another mechanism goes. That's called the glycocalyx. The glycocalyx lines the vasculature. It's a tension mechanism. It's hair. It's fur. And what it does is it uses mechanical tension to tell the tight junctions of the vasculature kind of where they should be at. You know, it's very similar to leaky gut, so you can get leaky vessels. So when this happens now, your percent likelihood of cardiovascular disease shoots through the roof. You just have a much higher percentage, and the reason has to do with a number of different things, but particular and unique to saturated fats is that over time, the body can accumulate oxysterols in the body. Now, the body's super good at getting rid of cholesterol. And that's why you can measure cholesterol intake and it doesn't seem to do anything. You know, you can measure someone, give them tons of cholesterol, it doesn't seem to do much. Body's really good at getting rid of it. It also doesn't stiffen the arteries. Not so with oxysterols. The body is terrible at getting rid of oxysterols. And there's different forms of them, and the different forms can be incredibly pathological. For example, there's one called 27-OH. So 27-OH is the primary oxysterol. Like when you look at Alzheimer's disease, and then they do samples of the spinal tissue of people with dementia, it's super saturated with 27-OH, and it's the primary oxysterol going into the brain. When you look at, it breaks CICO. It breaks the calories in, calories out paradigm. So what you see with mice, there have been tests done on mice where you give them 27-OH, they gain weight without changing calories, without more fat absorption. In other words, they just gain weight without assimilating without absorbing more fat. It's incredible.
And is that because of an effect on the HPA axis, or a downregulation of metabolic rate, or an impact on thyroid function or something?
I don't think it's known. I don't think we understand it yet. It seems to break the paradigm of calories in, calories out. But what you can see in humans is that when 27-OH is elevated, it's very difficult. You have a very hard time losing body fat. So to answer this question, there are these key problems happening in the vasculature as we get older. It's the increase of the NOx activation. It's the decline of the glycocalyx, and then the aggregation of oxysterols. All these things are happening all at once. And the net of these things is one big thing. All cardiovascular disease is characterized by a loss in nitric oxide production. So what happens is two things. One, we're producing less nitric oxide, and nitric oxide is becoming less bioavailable at the same time. So nitric oxide is going down. And then what is now happening is you can have saturated fats in the diet that cause no issue whatsoever when you were young. And now, because of the decline of the vasculature, you can be creating oxysterols and damaging the endothelium just due to the decline of the vasculature.
The idea here then would be we want to figure out how to keep nitric oxide elevated, keep the NOx hyperactivation down-regulated, and protect the glycocalyx. And I actually have talked about protecting the glycocalyx on shows before about heart health, sulfur-based compounds, for example, being one of the compounds that can help out with that. But when it comes to the whole NO NOx issue, how do you tackle that?
Diet-wise, which is what we're talking about, foundationally, there's two things. So the job is we have to increase nitric oxide production. We have to increase nitric oxide availability. We have to spin down NOx hyperactivation. And so the foundation for that are two food categories, which is nitrate-rich leafy greens, nitrate-rich vegetables, and then berries. Those two things cover the ground we need to cover. So nitrate-reducing bacteria in the mouth, essential. You must have them. Number one source, leafy greens, nitrate-rich veggies, number one source. And humans lack nitrate reductase. So this is the enzyme that reduces nitrate to nitrite. We lack it. And so the bacteria in the mouth are essential because they help increase nitric oxide production. And, there have been a lot of guys talking about this. We were just at an event together where one of the guys talks about the nitrate bacteria in the mouth and, mouthwash and all that stuff. And, this
I
is
shouldn't use mouthwash and fluoridated toothpaste because it'll decrease the activity of those. That's Nathan Bryan. He talked about that on my show. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you had him on. Yeah, Nathan. So yeah, I wrote about it in the new book as well, which is just that there's this bacteria in the mouth. They're essential. You have to have them and you have to feed them. And the way you feed them principally is through nitrate-rich veggies, principally. So the net of that, number one, is you're going to increase nitric oxide. Now, when you add berries into the picture, so berries have two effects. One is they tend to, across the board, favorably impact the NOx enzymes in different ways. Different berries will impact the NOx enzymes in different ways, but generally speaking, they tend to kind of turn down the rheostat on the NOx hyperactivation. So that's one thing. The other thing is they make nitric oxide more bioavailable. So dietarily speaking, these foraging foods seem to have a synergy that impacts the cardiovascular system in beneficial ways, particularly as we age.
Interesting. Okay, so that seems like a pretty easy way to do things versus just taking Viagra, I guess, for the nitric oxide piece. And then for the saturated fats, what you're saying is one could continue to eat saturated fats as they age, but the key would be including nitrate-rich veggies and berries as a staple in the diet.
I would call that the simple thing. Yeah, I would also add to that. Again, with our blueberry example, we started the whole show off with. We just quickly showed that you can get too much of anything, even a good thing. I mean, that didn't take much brain power to figure out. The funny thing, you'd never know it. We've entered this age where, there are groups of people out there right now that would vitriolically say, no, dude, there's no amount of saturated fat that could be detrimental. None. We've vindicated that. We know that now. There's no amount of cholesterol that could be bad. None. There's really people that think there's no amount, like this is immune from homeostasis. It's true of everything else. It's true of water. It's true of air. It's true of fiber, but not this stuff. No, you can't get to it. So when you take that argument, the first thing is when you look at all the studies ancestrally that have been done, there's kind of a range. There's a true north in ancestral diets. It seems to be roughly 7 to 11% of the diet was saturated fat, and that seems pretty consistent. You're a hunter. It's tough. Game animals are not the same as hybridized Holstein cows. They're very different in terms of the fat content. So I would just say that there's a true north that nature provides for saturated fats, and it's not an unlimited amount. It's kind of in this range.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me. I've got my elk hunt in 2 weeks. Okay. So we've got a little bit of time left, Joel, and these are going to be more like rapid fires. Obviously, I'm holding up your book right now. Go to bengreenfieldlife.com/immunity code if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details of all this stuff. But I'm going to throw a few at you, Joel. Some of these, you actually call them food hacks in the book. And you give me the 20, 30 second lightning flash as to why you think these are cool. Trypsin, go.
Cheese enzyme helps break down cheese, helps release a peptide in cheese, alpha queso something, I forget.
Alpha queso zepine. Zeppin?
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Age, I would have got that 20 years ago. Yeah, it helps you sleep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and you said you could break it open and add it to mozzarella. So you combine trypsin with cheese and it helps you to sleep. Oh, no. Okay. Citrus peels. I know you're a big fan of those.
Yeah. So, quick useful hack. If there's a nuclear war, you combine chlorella with citrus peels, and it's been shown to protect against radiation. But the big thing there is polymethoxyflavone. So polymethoxyflavone is it's found in citrus peels. Tangerine is a really good example of that. Mind-boggling stuff, really is. Works on a number of different levels. Very synergistic with apple peels, actually. So those two together in the diet a few times a week do a number of really good things. Possibly may help to burn brown fat and do all kinds of good things.
Right. So a lot of people who might be like peeling their apples or I don't know, like a peach or whatever, like you should actually be eating the peels of those. I assume you're not talking about like lemons and limes.
Yeah, no, not so much that, but like orange peels. As long as you can get, and the issue we're up against is getting unadulterated food. So that's the big challenge.
Yeah, and the bitterness. Jeez. Okay, so that's pretty cool actually about chlorella and peels. I didn't know that. How about trehalose? It appears as a sugar in a few of the shakes in the book. What is it about trehalose that you like?
Yeah, trehalose. It's an autophagy-inducing sugar. It seems to block mTOR, seems to work on a number of levels to induce autophagy. I first started writing about that one, I think, in 2021 on my Instagram, and I use it during the amplified fast every now and then, periodically. So it's really good to combine with fasting. It initiates autophagy, and it does a bunch of good stuff. So there was for a while some chatter about, well, you're going to spin up a certain bacteria that's toxic if you eat that, but it's true of all sugars. And anyways, it's something I've debunked.
Is it sweet like sugar? Like could you use it as a sugar substitute?
Yeah.
Okay. Just like Amazon, for example, I assume you can find this stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's easy to find.
I've never used it much. Okay, this is a fun one. It has to do with the dietary diversity piece, I think. Casein phosphopeptides in dairy.
Yeah, that just gets to all the cool stuff that's in dairy. I mean, dairy is like this treasure trove of peptides, and so this is a peptide that's found in dairy that makes a case for dietary diversity. What it does is helps bind heme iron. So like if you have meat in the diet and you're worried about iron overload, then dairy is a good way to neutralize that. And this is a peptide that helps to bind iron.
It reminds me of that. What's the tribe that the Maasai tribe that does the blood and the milk together as like a dietary staple? So they probably didn't know about the casein phosphopeptides. Just stumbled upon it ancestrally. There we go. The dairy with the meat and the dairy with the blood. Okay, nopales.
Yeah, man. Maybe. I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to either debunk or confirm this, but working theory may be the most powerful natural glucose disposal agent in the universe of foods.
Jeez.
I can't 100% say
that's from cactus.
It's cactus leaves. Yeah. Back in 2012, when I was doing my nutrition software, we had a bowl called the Napolita bowl, and I think I put that in the new book. But it's a very powerful glucose disposal agent. In fact, the way you know that's true is that there are cautions with diabetics about eating nopales because it can drop your blood sugar too much.
Interesting. Yeah, is that something that people like put into blood sugar control supplements now? Are there companies doing that?
I think there might be.
Huh? Yeah. Nopales.
I think there might be.
Well, if there isn't, they might want to think about it. I don't know. Yeah, it looks super interesting. Turns on AMP-K as well and increases glucose uptake by increasing the number. So yeah, so it's a GLUT4 or GLUT transporter agonist. Okay, how about palatinose? This is the last one, I promise, Joel. Palatinose.
Yeah, I first wrote about this back in 2006. It's a weight loss sugar, essentially. It's a sugar. It has most of the sweetness of sugar, but it seems to have a glycemic yield very similar to raw oats. So like if you're eating, the rate at which sugar hits the blood is very, very slow. So there's a company called the brand name is Beneo, and they've got research on it showing this stuff actually helps you drop weight. In fact, when I first wrote about it back in 2006, the headline was a weight loss sugar ? So
wow. So what I've learned is, like, for the sweetener section of my pantry, I could look into adding the trehalose and the palatinose, and then we talked about the honey and the stevia, and those would all be good ways to be sweetening my pre-dinner shakes and my my midnight blueberry ice cream.
2 pounds.
2 pounds of it. That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Joel, you are a wealth of knowledge as usual. And again, folks, like, if you like this episode, we cover so much more in the other two that we did, which are also highly relevant. This new book, The Way, The Immunity Code Diet, I'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. Highly recommend you read it. Don't worry. It's not like one of those things you got to be a nutritionist or a physician to be able to understand. There's even cartoons and QR codes and all sorts of helpful stuff in there. So I'll link to that at bengreenfieldlife.com/immunity code. Joel, thanks once again for crushing it, man.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's always an honor.
All right, folks. Well, I'm Ben Greenfield, along with the great Joel Greene, signing out from bengreenfieldlife.com/immunity code. Have an incredible week.
Do you want free access to comprehensive show notes, my weekly roundup newsletter, cutting-edge research and articles, top recommendations from me for everything that you need to hack your life, and a whole lot more? Check out bengreenfieldlife.com. It's all there. bengreenfieldlife.com. See you over there. Most of you who listen don't subscribe, like, or rate this show. If you're one of those people who do, then huge thank you. But here's why it's important to subscribe, like, and or rate this show. If you do that, that means we get more eyeballs, we get higher rankings, and the bigger the Ben Greenfield Life show gets, the bigger and better the guests get, and the better the content I'm able to deliver to you. So hit subscribe, leave a ranking, leave a review if you got a little extra time. It means way more than you might think. Thank you so much.